All right, welcome back. Welcome to the next video in our series here. So for this one, I'm going to jump right in. I want to talk to you about, I would say maybe the most important term when we think about organizations and society, when we think about corporate communication, that's stakeholders. And so I have this image up here because what I want you to take away is the idea of connection and relationships. So organizational communication, corporate communication is really all about figuring out how different stakeholders are connected and how they're connected to an organization and then communicating with them appropriately. So if you look at the definition here, it's in the book. You would find it in your textbook, but the need for companies to manage relationships with stakeholders is, both in theory and practice, one of the main purposes of corporate communication. So remember we talked about how uh, the communication part is like the glue for this human mosaic that is organizations. Well, we want to communicate then with stakeholders who are important for the organization. So then the question becomes, what is a stakeholder? So a couple definitions for you. First off, a stakeholder is any group or individual who can affect or is affected by the achievement of the organization's purpose and objectives, right? So again, a group, an individual, this could be a community organization, it could be a nonprofit, it could be an environmental group, it could be, in the case of an individual, it could be, for instance, a donor or somebody who owns a share within an organization. If we think about an institution like Belmont, students are primary stakeholders. They're absolutely critical. Your feedback matters. Faculty like me are critical stakeholders. So again, we can affect and we are affected by the achievement of the organization's purpose. So that's really what stakeholders is all about. And that quote is from Edward Freeman, and we'll talk about him in a second. Let's see. The second definition is from Archie Carroll, who does a lot of research in corporate social responsibility, especially, but he talks about the definition of a stake. It's an interest or a share in an undertaking. So it could be a business venture, it could be a project that an organization's working on, any kind of undertaking. And it can range from just an interest in that to a legal ownership over that. So if I'm an organization, if I'm Belmont and I'm trying to build something in the neighborhood next to Belmont, then I would have an interest in that if I'm a neighbor, right? If they're going to be blasting next to my neighborhood or something, or next to my house, I'm going to have an interest in that. We may want to talk about that. So, but I can also have a legal claim of ownership if I own property there. If I own one of the businesses where the blasting is going to be occurring. So again, it can think about a continuum, right? A range here. So this guy right here, and I'll post this where you can watch this, but Edward Freeman is kind of the father. You might want to call him the father of stakeholder theory, and he kind of talks about that, but I'll let you watch that. But there's a couple of really important perspectives that I want to share with you that are really important for us to think about. So the first is, we used to think of organizations in terms of economics, right? And we called primarily then what we would think about would be stockholders, right? You've probably heard that term before, stockholders. And really, it was all about what can an organization do that provides maximum output to a certain group, and that was usually customers. So if you see this image right here, investors would put money in, employees would put inputs in, suppliers would provide what organizations need. Who gets the benefit? The customers. So that was input output. That's economic theory right there. Now, what Edward Freeman did, though, is he came along and said, actually, there's a lot more to it. We want to think about not just input output, but interdependence. And we want to think about not just investors, suppliers, and employees, but a lot of other people. So, for instance, governments, political groups, trade organizations, communities, all these different groups, they actually not only are people who get stuff from the organization, but you can see what happens here. They put input in, and then it also goes back out. So if you're in the middle of that, if you're the organization, you got a lot more communicating to do, right? You got a lot more people to communicate with and a lot more people to communicate to. And so that's where the idea of interdependence comes in. That's where the idea of corporate communication comes in, right? Remember in the last module we talked about, it used to be about press. and just telling people what's going on. Now we got to communicate with a lot of people, and they're also communicating with us. So think about the circle and the boxes as more like they're perforated lines. So then the question becomes, how do we communicate? How do we do that? Well, there's three main ways, right, that we might think about communicating with stakeholders. One is informational, right? Organization has a message. They send it out through, for instance, a press release. The news picks it up, and the stakeholders get a chance to hear about that. The second is a persuasive, where it's still asymmetrical. We want to try to get the organization to buy into what we're doing, and we're going to persuade them accordingly. We're going to use tactics that are going to allow us to kind of bolster our image and bolster our reputation, et cetera. So, for instance, let's say an organization experiences a crisis. They're going to use tactics to point to the good things that they've been doing all along, and that's going to try to persuade the organization, the stakeholder group, the public, whoever it is, the press, the media, to think positively. The third one, though, which is the most robust form, is going to be called the dialogue strategy, which is two-way. Organization sends a message to stakeholders, and they want feedback back. So a lot of times, for instance, you would see, organizations have methods in place on their website, for instance, where they would be able to actually collect feedback from the stakeholders and then go ahead and change their practices. In more radical cases, you might even see, an organization that would, host some sort of a town hall, or maybe a community event where they would try to get dialogue. They would try to generate and initiate a genuine dialogue. It might very well be persuasive, but what it is it allows the feedback to try to change practices. Nowadays, the first and second one are used, but people demand dialogue, right? Think about that. As a stakeholder for any organization, you've got the power of this device, and you can communicate back. That doesn't mean they're always listening, but you can communicate with any organization at any time, and you expect that, right? Stakeholders can talk back. The informational strategy worked great in the 1960s and 70s when people couldn't talk back. Now you can. So that you see that dialogue being absolutely necessary with all those people around that circle in terms of who has a seat at the table. So a couple of key takeaways for you here to think about would be, one is that we moved from economic input-output to now stakeholders, broader range of stakeholders. And now this definition of stake, who has a stake in an organization, has expanded greatly. A lot of it has to do with the new media landscape, and that more people have a say